Hello, everyone. This is chapter 1 of the book written by Adam Grant Originals. And it's kind of a long one, so you might want to take the time with a cup of coffee, or you might want to just make up your mind to divide it up into 2. But the whole segment is chapter 1, and it's a little bit long, but enjoy. Chapter 1, Creative Destruction. The risky business of going against the grain. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Quote by George Bernard Shaw. On a cool fall evening in 2008, 4 students set out to revolutionize an industry. Buried in loans, they had lost and broken eyeglasses and were outraged at how much it cost to replace them. One of them had been wearing the same damaged pair for 5 years. He was using a paper clip to bind the frames together. Even after his prescription changed twice, he refused to pay for pricey new lenses. Luxottica, the 800-pound gorilla of the industry, controlled more than 80% of the eyewear market. To make glasses more affordable, the students would need to topple a giant. Having recently watched Zappos transform footwear by selling shoes online, they wondered if they could do the same with eyewear. When they casually mentioned their idea to friends, time and again they were blasted with scorching criticism. No one would ever buy glasses over the internet, their friends insisted. People had to try them on first. Sure, Zappos had pulled the concept off with shoes, but there was a reason it hadn't happened with eyewear. If this were a good idea, they heard repeatedly, someone would have already done it. None of the students had a background in e-commerce and technology, let alone in retail, fashion, or apparel. Despite being told their idea was crazy, they walked away from lucrative jobs offers to start a company. They would sell eyeglasses that normally cost $500 in a store for $95 online, donating a pair to someone in the developing world with every purchase. The business depended on a functioning website. Without one, it would be impossible for customers to view or buy their products. After scrambling to pull a website together, they finally managed to get it online at 4 a.m. on the day before they launched in February 2010. They called the company Warby Parker, combining the names of 2 characters created by the novelist Jack Kerouac, who inspired them to break free from the shackles of social pressure and embark on their adventure. They admired this rebellious spirit, infusing it into their culture, and it paid off. The students expected to sell a pair or 2 of glasses per day, but when GQ called them the Netflix of eyewear, they hit their target for the entire first year in less than a month, selling out so fast that they had to put 20,000 customers on a waiting list. It took them 9 months to stock enough inventory to meet the demand. Fast forward to 2015, when Fast Company released a list of the world's most innovative companies. Warby Parker didn't just make the list, they came in first. The 3 previous winners were creative giants Google, Nike, and Apple, all with over 50,000 employees. Warby Parker's scrappy startup, a new kid on the block, had a staff of just 500. In the span of 5 years, the 4 friends built one of the most fashionable brands on the planet and donated over 1 million pairs of glasses to people in need. The company cleared $100 million in annual revenues and was valued at over $1 billion. Back in 2009, one of the founders pitched the company to me, offering me the chance to invest in Warby Parker. I declined. It was the worst financial decision I had ever made, and I needed to understand where I went wrong. Original. The origin or the source of something, from which something springs, proceeds, or is derived. Original, noun. A thing of singular or unique character, a person who is different from other people in an appealing or interesting way. A person of fresh initiative or inventive capacity. Years ago, psychologists discovered that there are two routes to achievement: conformity and originality. Conformity means following the crowd down conventional paths and maintaining the status quo. Originality is taking the road less traveled, championing a set of novel ideas that go against the grain but ultimately make things better. Of course, nothing is completely original, in the sense that all of our ideas are influenced by what we learn from the world around us. We are constantly borrowing thoughts, whether intentionally or inadvertently. We're all vulnerable to kleptomnesia, accidentally remembering the ideas of others as our own. By my definition, originality involves introducing and advancing an idea that's relatively unusual within a particular domain, and that has the potential to improve it. Originality itself starts with creativity, generating a concept that is both novel and useful. But it doesn't stop there. Originals are people who take the initiative to make their visions a reality. The Warby Parker founders had the originality to dream up an unconventional way to sell glasses online, but became originals by taking action to make them easily accessible and affordable. This book is about how we can all become more original. There's a surprising clue in the web browser that you use to surf the internet. Finding the faults in defaults. Not long ago, economist Michael Hausman was leading a project to figure out why some customer service agents stayed in their jobs longer than others. Armed with data from over 30,000 employees who handled calls for banks, airlines, and cell phone companies, he suspected that their employment histories would contain telltale signs about their commitment. He thought that people with a history of job hopping would quit sooner, but they didn't. Employees who had held 5 jobs in the past 5 years weren't any more likely to leave their positions than those who had stayed in the same job for 5 years. Hunting for other hints, he noticed that his team had captured information about which internet browser employees had used when they logged in to apply for their jobs. On a whim, he tested whether that choice might be related to quitting. He didn't expect to find any correlation, assuming that browser preference was purely a matter of taste. But when he looked at the results, he was stunned. Employees who used Firefox or Chrome to browse the web remained in their jobs 15% longer than those who used Internet Explorer or Safari. Thinking it was a coincidence, Hausman ran the same analysis for absences from work. The pattern was the same. Firefox and Chrome users were 19% less likely to miss work than Internet Explorer and Safari fans. Then he looked at performance. His team had assembled nearly 3 million data points on sales, customer satisfaction, and average call length. The Firefox and Chrome users had significantly higher sales, and their call times were shorter. Their customers were happier too. After 90 days on the job, the Firefox and Chrome users had customer satisfaction levels that Internet Explorer and Safari users reached only after 120 days at work. It's not the browser itself that's causing them to stick around, show up dependably, and succeed. Rather, it's what their browser preference signals about their habits. Why are the Firefox and Chrome users more committed and better performers on every metric? The obvious answer was that they're more tech savvy, so I asked Hausman if he could explore that. The employees had all taken a computer proficiency test, which assessed their knowledge of the keyboard shortcuts, software programs, and hardware, as well as a time test for their typing speed. But the Firefox and Chrome group didn't prove to have significantly more computer expertise, and they weren't faster or more accurate typists. Even after accounting for those scores, the browser effect persisted. Technical knowledge and skill weren't the source of their advantage. What made the difference was how they obtained the browser. If you own a PC, Internet Explorer is built into Windows. If you're a Mac user, your computer came pre-installed with Safari. Almost 2/3 of the customer service agents used the default browser, never questioning whether a better one was available. To get Firefox or Chrome, you have to demonstrate some resourcefulness and download a different browser. Instead of accepting the default, you take a bit of initiative to seek out an option that might be better. And that act of initiative, however tiny, is a window into what you do at work. The customer service agents who accepted the defaults of Internet Explorer and Safari approached their job the same way. They stayed on script in sales calls and followed standard operating procedures for handling customer complaints. They saw their job descriptions as fixed. So when they were unhappy with their work, they started missing days and eventually just quit. The employees who took the initiative to change their browsers to Firefox or Chrome approached their jobs differently. They looked for novel ways of selling to customers and addressing their concerns. When they encountered a situation they didn't like, they fixed it. Having taken the initiative to improve their circumstances, they had little reason to leave. They created the jobs they wanted, but they were the exception, not the rule. We live in an Internet Explorer world. Just as almost 2/3 of the customer service reps use the default browser on their computers, many of us accept the defaults in our own lives. In a series of provocative studies, a team led by political psychologist John Jost explored how people responded to undesirable default conditions. Compared to European Americans, African Americans were less satisfied with their economic circumstances but perceived economic inequality as more legitimate and just. Compared to people in the highest income bracket, people in the lowest income bracket were 17% more likely to view economic inequality as necessary. And when asked whether they would support laws that limit the rights of citizens and the press to criticize the government if enacting such legislation was necessary to solve our nation's problems, twice as many people in the lowest income bracket were willing to give up the right to free speech as those in the highest income bracket. After finding that disadvantaged groups consistently supported the status quo more than the advantaged groups, Jost and his colleagues concluded, people who suffer the most from a given state of affairs are paradoxically the least likely to question, challenge, reject, or change it. To explain this peculiar phenomenon, Jost's team developed a theory of system justification. Its core idea is that people are motivated to rationalize the status quo as legitimate, even if it goes directly against their interest. In one study, they tracked Democratic and Republican voters before the 2000 U.S. presidential election. When George W. Bush gained in the polls, Republicans rated him as more desirable, but so did Democrats, who were already preparing justifications for the anticipated status quo. The same happened when Al Gore's likelihood of success increased. Both Republicans and Democrats judged him more favorably. Regardless of political ideologies, when a candidate seemed destined to win, people liked him more. When his odds dropped, they liked him less. Justifying the default system serves a soothing function. It's an emotional painkiller. If the world is supposed to be this way, we don't need to be dissatisfied with it. But acquiescence also robs us of the moral outrage to stand against injustice and the creative will to consider alternative ways that the world could work. The hallmark of originality is rejecting the default and exploring whether a better option exists. I've spent more than a decade studying this, and it turns out to be far less difficult than I expected. The starting point is curiosity, pondering why the default exists in the first place. We're driven to question defaults when we experience vujade, the opposite of deja vu. Deja vu occurs when we encounter something new, but it feels as if we've seen it before. Vujade is the reverse. We face something familiar, but we see it with a fresh perspective that enables us to gain new insights into old problems. Without Avuja Devent, Warby Parker wouldn't have existed. When the founders were sitting in the computer lab on the night they conjured up the company, they had spent a combined 60 years wearing glasses. The product had always been unreasonably expensive, but until that moment, they had taken the status quo for granted, never questioning the default price. The thought had never crossed my mind, co-founder Dave Gilboa says. I had always considered them a medical purchase. I naturally assumed that if a doctor was selling it to me, there was some justification for the price. Having recently waited in line at the Apple store to buy an iPhone, he found himself comparing the two products. Glasses had been a staple of human life for nearly 1,000 years, and they'd hardly changed since his grandfather wore them. For the first time, Dave wondered why glasses had such a hefty price tag. Why did such a fundamentally simple product cost more than a complex smartphone? Anyone could have asked those questions and arrived at the same answer that the Warby Parker squad did. Once they became curious about why the price was so steep, they began doing some research on the eyewear industry. That's when they learned that it was dominated by Luxottica, a European company that had raked in over $7 billion the previous year. Understanding that the same company owned LensCrafters and Pearle Vision, Ray-Ban, and Oakley, and the licenses for Chanel and Prada prescription frames and sunglasses, all of a sudden, it made sense to me why glasses were so expensive, Dave says. Nothing in the cost of goods justified the price. Taking advantage of its monopoly status, Luxottica was charging 20 times the cost. The default wasn't inherently legitimate. It was a choice made by a group of people at a given company. And this meant that another group of people could make an alternative choice. We could do things differently. Dave suddenly understood. It was a realization that we could control our own destiny, that we could control our own prices. When we become curious about the dissatisfying defaults in our world, we begin to recognize that most of them have social origins. Rules and systems were created by people, and that awareness gives us the courage to contemplate how we can change them. Before women gained the right to vote in America, many had never before considered their degraded status as anything but natural, historian Jean Baker observes. As the suffrage movement gained momentum, a growing number of women were beginning to see that custom, religious precept, and law were in fact man-made and therefore reversible. The two faces of ambition. The pressure to accept defaults starts much earlier than we realize. If you consider the individuals who will grow up and make a dent in the universe, the first group that probably comes to mind is child prodigies. These geniuses learn to read at age 2, play Bach at 4, breeze through calculus at 6, and speak 7 languages fluently by 8. Their classmates shudder with jealousy. Their parents rejoice at having won the lottery. But to paraphrase T.S. Eliot, their careers tend to end not with a bang, but with a whimper. Child prodigies, it turns out, rarely go on to change the world. When psychologists study history's most eminent and influential people, they discover that many of them weren't unusually gifted as children. And if you assemble a large group of child prodigies and follow them for their entire lives, you'll find that they don't outshine their less precocious peers from families of similar means. Intuitively, this makes sense. We assume that what gifted kids have in book smarts, they lack in street smarts. While they have the intellectual chops, they must lack the social, emotional, and practical skills to function in society. When you look at the evidence, though, this explains falls short. This explanation falls short. Less than a quarter of gifted children suffer from social and emotional problems. The vast majority are well adjusted, as delightful as a cocktail party as in a spelling bee. Although child prodigies are often rich in both talent and ambition, what holds them back from moving the world forward is that they don't learn to be original. As they perform in Carnegie Hall, win the Science Olympics, and become chess champions, something tragic happens. Practice makes perfect, but it doesn't make new. The gifted learn to play magnificent Mozart melodies and beautiful Beethoven symphonies, but never compose their own original scores. They focus their energy on consuming exciting scientific knowledge, not producing new insights. They conform to the codified rules of established games rather than inventing their own rules or their own games. All along the way, they strive to earn the approval of their parents and the admiration of their teachers. Research demonstrates that it is the most creative children who are least likely to become the teacher's pet. In one study, elementary school teachers listed their favorite and least favorite students, and then rated them both groups on a list of characteristics. The least favorite students were the nonconformists who made up their own rules. Teachers tend to discriminate against highly creative students, labeling them as troublemakers. In response, many children quickly learn to get with the program, keeping their original ideas to themselves. In the language of author William Deresiewicz, they become the world's most excellent shape. In adulthood, many child prodigies become experts in their fields and leaders in their organizations. Yet only a fraction of gifted children eventually become revolutionary adult creators, laments psychologist Ellen Winter. Those who do must make a painful transition from a child who learns rapidly and effortlessly in an established domain to an adult who ultimately remakes a domain. Most prodigies never make that leap. They apply their extraordinary abilities in ordinary ways, mastering their jobs without questioning defaults and without making waves. In every domain they enter, they play it safe by following the conventional paths to success. They become doctors who heal their patients without fighting to fix the broken systems that prevent many patients from affording health care in the first place. They become lawyers who defend clients for violating outdated laws without trying to transform the laws themselves. They become teachers who plan engaging algebra lessons without questioning whether algebra is what their students need to learn. Although we rely on them to keep the world running smoothly, they keep us running on a treadmill. Child prodigies are hindered by achievement motivation. The drive to succeed is responsible for many of the world's greatest accomplishments. When we're determined to excel, we have the fuel to work harder, longer, and smarter. But as cultures rack up a significant number of achievements, originality is increasingly left to a specialized few. When achievement motivation goes sky high, it can crowd out originality. The more you value achievement, the more you come to dread failure. Instead of aiming for unique accomplishments, the intense desire to succeed leads us to strive for guaranteed success. As psychologists Todd Lobart and Robert Sternberg put it, once people pass an intermittent level in the need to achieve, there is evidence that they actually become less creative. The drive to succeed and the accompanying fear of failure have held back some of the greatest creators and change agents in history. Concerned with maintaining stability and attaining conventional achievements, they have been reluctant to pursue originality. Instead of charging full steam ahead with assurance, they have become coaxed, convinced, or coerced to take a stand. While they may seem to have possessed the qualities of natural leaders, they were figuratively and sometimes literally lifted up by followers and peers. If a handful of people hadn't been cajoled into taking original action, America might not exist. The civil rights movements could still be a dream. The Sistine Chapel might be bare. We might still believe the sun revolves around the earth, and the personal computer might never have been popularized. From our perspective today, the Declaration of Independence seems inevitable, but it nearly didn't happen due to the reluctance of key revolutionaries. The men who took commanding roles in the American Revolution were as unlikely a group of revolutionaries as one can imagine. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jack Rakove recounts, "They became revolutionaries despite themselves. In the years leading up to the war, John Adams feared British retaliation and hesitated to give up his budding law career. He only got involved after being elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. George Washington had been focused on managing his wheat, flour, fishing, and horse breeding businesses, joining the cause only after Adams nominated him as commander-in-chief of the army. I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it," Washington wrote. Nearly 2 centuries later, Martin Luther King was apprehensive about leading the civil rights movement. His dream was to be a pastor and a college president. In 1955, after Rosa Parks was tried for refusing to give up her seat at the front of a bus, a group of civil rights activists gathered to discuss their response. They agreed to form the Montgomery Improvement Association and launch a bus boycott, and one of the attendees nominating King for the presidency. It had happened so quickly that I did not even have time to think it through. It is probable that if I had, I would have declined the nomination, King reflected. Just 3 weeks earlier, King and his wife had agreed that I should not then take on any heavy community responsibilities, since I had so recently finished my thesis and needed to give more attention to my church work. He was unanimously elected to lead the boycott. Faced with giving a speech to the community that evening, I became possessed by fear. King would overcome that trepidation soon enough that in 1963, his thundering voice united a country around an electrifying vision of freedom. But that only happened because a colleague proposed that King should be the closing speaker at the March on Washington and gathered a coalition of leaders to advocate for him. When the Pope commissioned him to paint a fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo wasn't interested. He viewed himself as a sculptor, not a painter, and found the task so overwhelming that he fled to Florence. 2 years would pass before he began work on the project at the Pope's insistence. And astronomy stagnated for decades because Nicholas Copernicus refused to publish his original discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun. Fearing rejection and ridicule, he stayed silent for 22 years, circulating his findings only to his friends. Eventually, a major cardinal learned of his work and wrote a letter encouraging Copernicus to publish it. Even then, Copernicus stalled for 4 more years. His magnum opus only saw the light of day after a young mathematics professor took matters into his own hands and submitted it for publication. Almost half a millennium later, when an angel investor offered $250,000 to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak to bankroll Apple in 1977, it came with an ultimatum. Wozniak would have to leave Hewlett-Packard. He refused. "I still intended to be at that company forever," Wozniak reflects. My psychological block was really that I didn't want to start a company because I was just afraid, he admits. Wozniak changed his mind only after being encouraged by Jobs, multiple friends, and his own parents. We can only imagine how many Wozniaks, Michelangelos, and Kings never pursued, publicized, or promoted their original ideas because they were not dragged or catapulted into the spotlight. Although we may not aspire to start our own companies, create a masterpiece, or transform Western thought, or lead a civil rights movement, we do have ideas for improving our workplaces, schools, and communities. Sadly, many of us hesitate to take action to promote those ideas. As economist Joseph Schumpeter famously observed, originality is an act of creative destruction. Advocating for new systems often requires demolishing the old way of doing things, and we hold back for fear of rocking the boat. Among nearly 1,000 scientists at the Food and Drug Administration, more than 40% were afraid that they would face retaliation if they spoke up publicly about safety concerns. Of more than 40,000 employees at a technology company, half felt it was not safe to voice dissenting opinions at work. When employees in consulting, financial services, media, pharmaceuticals, and advertising companies were interviewed, 85% admitted to keeping quiet about an important concern rather than voicing it to their bosses. The last time you had an original idea, what did you do with it? Although America is a land of individuality and unique self-expression in search of excellence and in fear of failure, most of us opt to fit in rather than stand out. On matters of style, swim with the current, Thomas Jefferson allegedly advised, but on matters of principle, stand like a rock. The pressure to achieve leads us to do the opposite. We find surface ways of appearing original, donning a bow tie, donning a bow tie, wearing bright red shoes, without taking the risk of actually being original. When it comes to the powerful ideas in our heads and the core values in our hearts, we censor ourselves. There's so few originals in life, says renowned executive Melody Hobson, because people are afraid to speak up and stand out. What are the habits of the people whose originality extends beyond appearance to effective action? And we will pause here because if you guys were looking at the screen, my battery on the phone is dying. I will do a separate audio clip for this next section, beginning with the right stuff.